This evening's session is AI beyond the hype cycle, and I think we can all agree there is a fair amount of hype around AI. In conversation with Amba, who's the executive director of the AI Now Institute, we're proud to have Meredith Whittaker, who's the president of Signal, and Udbhav Tiwari, who is with Mozilla. Over to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is the most on-time event I have ever been to, and I'm really proud because I made a lot of Indian Standard Time jokes all week. So thank you all for being part of this conversation. Vidushi Madha, who's an international expert on AI governance, was going to be with us today, but she just came back from international travel and she couldn't be with us. So I'm going to be doing that weird thing where I'm part moderating, part talking, and I'll try not to take up too much share of voice in the conversation. But okay, so AI and beyond the hype cycle. So this whole year seems like it has been one long, I don't even know if it's a wave, but one long kind of AI hype moment. It's hard to tell whether it peaked with the release of ChatGPT, or was it GPT-4, or was it all of these self-appointed frontier AI labs, if you've heard that name in the news, kind of launching various generative AI applications, but then also kind of committing that they will self-regulate themselves with President Biden's blessings not so long ago. And this has been sort of a slow drumbeat, and we'll talk more about it, but there's also been this kind of debate about whether generative AI is just a stepping stone to artificial general intelligence, heavy scare quotes, who knows what that means, but the idea that we are just a stepping stone away from some other new and novel and potentially scary, dangerous, excited, depending on where you stand on that debate, form of technology. And all of this has happened in less than a year, which is wild. So we are going to try and maybe, as we always try to do, start there, but try to redirect attention and talk about some of the issues that we think AI helpfully brings up. There was already a bit of an introduction, so maybe I can skip it. I'll ask a kind of table-setting question to get us started, and I'll answer it last, which is, how does AI relate to your work, Meredith and Udbhav?
Yeah, well, AI is more of a marketing term than a term of art. And over its 70 years in history, it's been applied to a wide and disparate variety of technical approaches. So it is more of a signal of an aspiration. We want to make something that to us seems human-like than it is a description of the technological affordances of whatever in a given decade we're calling AI. So at this moment, the thing that we're marketing, or we in scare quotes, as AI is very data intensive, very compute intensive, probabilistic models. And this data and compute, of course, are the resources, the concentrated resources at the heart of the surveillance business model that are currently in the hands of a handful of large companies who are the only ones that have the affordances, the resources to create these large-scale models from start to finish, from development through deployment. So my work at Signal relates to AI in that AI is exacerbating this surveillance business model. It is calling for more and more data on everyone. It is also producing surveillance. The AI itself is fundamentally a surveillance technology. It is surveilling people. It is making determinations, whether they're right or wrong, about people's place in the world, about communities, about our society, our politics, our economy. And those determinations themselves become data, even as these large AI systems are calling for more and more data, more and more aspects of our lives to be surveilled, numerated, put into databases, and fed into these systems. So Signal, we can understand Signal, if you were at the last talk, Signal is the world's largest truly private messaging app. If you're not using it, I invite you to use it. It's free. It's on the App Store, the Play Store. But Signal does not collect data. Our entire purpose, our entire reason for being is to provide a safe haven from the voracious surveillance that is at the heart of the tech business model. And in that sense, you can see Signal as sort of, a counterforce against this AI hype, this surveillance economy, and the surveillance capacities of these larger and larger so-called AI systems.
Thanks. I think there are two answers. One, the first one for how is this related to my work personally. One of the first things that I started doing when I entered this space many years ago was actually India's Aadhaar project. And one of the first most interesting tidbits of information that was given to me was that the algorithm that deduplicates biometric information in the Aadhaar database is a closed source, privately designed American algorithm that uses machine learning technologies to perform that deduplication, but we have no clue how it works. And I spent like a day looking the company up, the project up, and how it actually works. And I think that it was also one of the things that was raised in court during the challenge of the Aadhaar. But that was very much my first exposure to AI, which is this idea that there are technologies that make such consequential decisions to us and to society as a whole that are not only so poorly understood, but there are incentives built into those ecosystems for why they should never be understood. And that also in some way ties into Mozilla, because Mozilla as an organization was an organization that was, I think, born at a very similar paradigm shift as out of the ashes of the browser was, when there was Netscape and there were these like big browsers, and some folks decided that what they wanted to do was to come up with a system that would allow them to create what something different in the space may look like. And right now, I think Mozilla is very much going through a very similar transition phase as an organization as well, where they're looking at not just how do we continue the Firefox browser and everything that happens there, but how do we bring the values that Mozilla has of being open source, truly open source, of working with communities around the world and not just organizations into the AI space. And recently we've spun up a new entity called Mozilla.ai, which is a research lab that will attempt to answer this in practice. But on the Mozilla Foundation side, it's something that for many years we've worked under the broader umbrella of trustworthy AI, of trying to interrogate some of these questions independent of the generative AI lens, whether it's bias, whether it's discrimination. And it's work that has touched many parts of the world, and I think some of the most successful fellows that we've had as a part of our fellow program, for example, working on AI, have been from India as well.
Yeah. And then I think I'll say a little from my perspective. I think one, like Meredith pointed out, it is a marketing term. Like you pointed out, there's a lot of definitional ambiguity. But at the end of the day, and maybe this has never been more true, AI is like a signifier that carries a lot of weight. It brings a lot of media. It moves a lot of philanthropic capital. It's doing a lot of work in the world, whether or not we think there is a clear definition. And so in that sense, the work that we've tried to do at AI Now, and there's several others that would be in the same boat, is try to use AI as a portal to discuss a range of issues. One way in which we've done that is to move away from the term. So we start by saying AI, but very quickly in the policy space, we try to prefer the term automated decision systems, because it moves attention away from these mythical, magical, potentially intelligent systems to decisions that are making to decision systems that are making decisions about allocating resources, about kind of curating our social and economic lives every day in very real ways. So kind of redirecting attention from the abstract to the very kind of rooted contextual definition. So we prefer to use the term ADS, or automated decision systems, and that term has actually successfully gained quite a lot of currency in policy conversations, particularly in the US. So that's one. And then I think the other, we're a policy research organization, so the other way in which AI is kind of interesting is if you start disaggregating it, like we just discussed, into its composite like input. So if AI is about data, compute, and certain kinds of algorithmic and statistical models, then we try and think of the various policy levers that influence every part of this stack. So one of the things we like to say, particularly in this moment when everyone's telling us that there's a blank regulatory slate and we have these new technologies, so we need new regulation, is we try and say, actually, we already have regulation to regulate data, right? So we have data privacy law is AI policy. We say competition law that regulates big tech is AI policy. So we're not starting from a blank slate. So that's just kind of an example of how we play with AI as a portal, both in terms of the issues that get attention and funding. And just on that, I just remembered Aadhaar many years ago being in rooms with various funders and others trying to make the pitch for why Aadhaar was kind of like AI, so that I could actually be both media attention and funding for those that were interrogating and challenging that system. So moving on, maybe the other, let's go back to the hype moment, for better or worse. Like I said, there's a spectrum between, what is it, like Skynet, killer robot, the world is going to end on one end, and on the other there's this technology is the best thing that's ever happened to us. It's going to change the way in which we think, we read, we educate, we learn, we create, and it's the best thing that's ever happened. And interestingly, both ends of this spectrum are advocated by by people who are either within the tech industry or in some way easy to trace back to the tech industry. So that seems confusing, as does the fact that a lot of these people are saying that AI regulation is a good thing. So I'm going to ask you guys to help make sense of what seems like a kind of confusing place we're at.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I think, I want to double down on the point that Amba made, that this is, what we're talking about when we talk about AI is almost a kind of narrative strategy, right? We can call these systems machine learning. We can call these systems automated decision systems. We can call them spreadsheet formulas that are marketed by a for-profit that doesn't open their code as AI, right? This term is, wrapped up in a lot of mythologizing. And, I think there has been a recognition on the part of industry, who has, hundreds of millions of dollars in marketing budget and has been pretty canny about telling certain stories about tech that have, led to their growth and proliferation, that, when Microsoft released the, ChatGPT, which is an advertisement for their Azure GPT APIs, there was a recognition that, this could be narrated as a sort of step change in AI progress, that we could narrate generative AI, which, the technologies, the transformers have been around since like 2017, and there's a different architecture, but the premise is ultimately the same, and it has been since the late 80s with convolutional neural nets, right? You need more data and more compute, and that is still the premise. It's a bigger is better brute force paradigm that continues. But nonetheless, when Microsoft released ChatGPT, suddenly they saw an opportunity to almost break with reality, to deny that there had been regulatory processes that had been ongoing, to deny that this generative AI was related to the genealogy of different machine learning techniques that had come before it, and to almost narrate this in what I would call theological terms. Right? That this is, artificial general intelligence. Our machines almost have consciousness. Will they kill us or will they save us? But sort of to divorce that discourse so much from reality that it was sort of taking us away from all of the work that had been done for the last 10 years. And so I want to make that point, because I think that whether or not you're narrating, the godlike machine as a savior or as a threat, what you are doing is selling technology that is only possible for a handful of corporations, largely based in the US and China, to create as super powerful. And every government, every large corporation, every sizable institution, whether they think it's a threat or not, wants it on their side, wants to sign a contract with Microsoft for that GPT API, wants to figure out how to use that technology to control their workers, to control their populations, to otherwise sort of benefit themselves. And so I think what we're seeing is ultimately a large marketing effort that has taken on the patina of a scientific discourse without any of the connection to scientific reality.
Thanks. I think that the only thing I'd add to that is I do think that we're definitely seeing this trend of people in charge of these companies moving from a don't regulate us because that will stifle innovation to regulate us like crazy because this is really risky and dangerous and important. And I think it's important to interrogate the reasons behind why they may be adopting such a stance. And I think those stances, the simplified kind of analysis is they want to create regulatory moats around themselves. They want to make it easier for them to create these products and services. And if the price for that is, say, something as harsh as licensing, which I never thought I would see a day when I would see a CEO say, I want to create created technology.
Give that example so that
So like Brad Smith, for example, when he was in the room in like the US Senate is currently conducting these set of hearings on AI because they want to understand the field better, like openly advocated for why technology should be, like why he would be comfortable with the idea that certain kinds of generative technology should be licensed, which means you apply to a government with an application for why you should be allowed to create it, and then that license is granted and you have the sole ability to therefore do that, which is antithetical to the idea of how like Silicon Valley and that entire like technology culture has spent the last couple of decades evolving.
Permissionless innovation.
Exactly. But I think that there's kind of a deeper point to that as well, which is to interrogate what are the other ways in which painting this picture of a Skynet that will destroy the world and them being the individuals who will prevent that Skynet from destroying the world creates in the image that they're creating around themselves. And it's very much a 6 to 8 month old paradigm. It wasn't even happening before that. And I think the reason that's happening, and this kind of ties to the second point that I wanted to bring in under regulation, is all of the traditional ways in which technology has either been kept in check or its problems been better understood, and ways in which it's been made a communal resource are ideas like open source. Because what's happened there is people create code that other people can use and understand and then deploy, and if they find problems, improve. Apart from the points that Meredith and you have already raised around compute and why that's actually impossible to do in AI, that very model is also a threat to the idea of these companies having the ability to create or be the sole individuals who create these ability to perform these generative AI functions, and they view them as a threat, which is why when you see apart from the licensing conversations in say Europe and the AI Act in America, there's this entire threat which is very similar to the way encryption was being portrayed in the late 1990s to the early 2000s, which is the way that the government regulated encryption was they actually prohibited its export. They literally said that you cannot send these 15 lines of code, because if you send them out, then some terrorist somewhere will be able to send messages we cannot read and you cannot put them out. And it ended in really banal ways, right? Like people literally there were Supreme Court cases, but they printed them on a t-shirt and shipped the t-shirt, and the t-shirt had those lines of code printed on it. And what most people don't really realize is that we're well past that point when it comes to AI, right? With a lot of the open source models and releases that we're seeing. So if one acknowledges that open source may not fix all the problems with AI, but it certainly adds a different lens to it that is not complete corporate control, then how does regulation intersect with open source? Because there are so many other questions that come under that around liability, around developers, around the idea of community and generative AI, around training, around data, that I think are some of the more interesting questions in this regulation debate that as I think we'll come to that over the course of the conversation and we can go there.
Yeah, I want to come back to that. But another thing you just said about export controls is a good reminder that this isn't just a conversation, like an abstract conversation. It's also a very securitized conversation, which means that it's become that if you talk about AI, you're also talking about national security. And that's being used as a strategy to kind of, in some ways, muzzle voices that are in favor of accountability and governance, right? So there's two versions of this argument. One is, and we have literally been on the receiving end of this for the last several months as a policy organization. One is that we're told that if you are promoting, whether it's antitrust and competition interventions or it's algorithmic accountability regulation, you're essentially slowing the US generative AI companies down, and we're in a race against China, and what we need right now is not regulatory slowdown. In fact, we need to win because, of course, democracy is at stake. So that's one version of the argument, and I would say that's maybe the more rudimentary or not very sophisticated argument. The other thing we're seeing is this version of how just, again, the policy space has become absolutely saturated away from questions of discrimination, accountability, the impact on the labor workforce, the impact of AI on the creative industries. All of those issues have been very deliberately sidelined, and the main issue that we're all meant to be discussing, and the UK's upcoming AI summit is in all likelihood going to be framed around these lines, is about the idea that LLMs, large language models, and other AI will make it easier to create weapons that can be used in kind of transnational warfare, specifically bioweapons. So the idea that large language models can now create bioweapons or make it easier to create bioweapons, which, by the way, biologists and other researchers are continually saying is an absolute overblown idea based on one archive article, which no one is able to fully kind of draw that line. despite that kind of very flimsy evidence base, suddenly all we're talking about when we're talking about AI is, but what about if China or Russia is able to make bioweapons? So it's this kind of strange, move where I would say just the air out of the room, similar to what you were saying, Meredith. If it's it's either terrorism or child protection, and with AI, it is definitely national security. And one of the counter moves is to say that for national security, you kind of need accountable AI systems, and you need less kind of concentrated AI ecosystems as well. But open source AI. So I think that's there's just a lot to unpack in what you just said. You gave the kind of relevant context, which is right now open source AI. Again, there's a spectrum. Either it's really scary and you're letting the whatever bogeyman out and everyone has access to these powerful technologies, or on the other hand, we're hearing that open source equals democratizing this technology, which means any old startup and anybody can produce their own AI technology, and how wonderful this is the new tech paradigm. So again, would just want your thoughts on where we might lie on that spectrum, or in your opinion.
Yeah. I have a 30-page academic paper for all of you on this. I just wrote on this with Sarah Myers-West, who's the managing director at AI Now and has been doing a lot of work on compute and centralized power in AI, and David Whittaker, who's a PhD at CMU who did some work there. So I'm drawing from a paper that I co-authored with them. I think on the sort of one end of the spectrum, right, it's like if we open source AI, then the bad guys will get it and we will be ruined, it's kind of a quaint argument that is almost made for Hollywood, because of course the same companies making this argument are licensing the same AI from their cloud servers, right? So why is it different that I spin up an Azure API call for GPT-4 than I pull a pre-built model off the shelf and sort of work with Hugging Face to tune it, right? And so I think it kind of falls apart just on the fact that these are commodity products, they are commercialized, they're available to the people who will pay for them with some restrictions, but let's be real, not the kind of restrictions we're talking about if we're talking about this sort of sentient bioweapon creating machine, right? Which we're not, that's not actually true. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the sort of AI, open source will democratize everything. We're looking at a lot of wishful thinking and confused projection, some of which is being weaponized by the same companies that are making these arguments. So, we kind of at the beginning were like AI is a marketing term, right? One of the issues we're facing is there is no clear definition of AI itself. And then you layer the term open or open source on that, and how does that relate to the open source initiative definition of open source software, right? It actually doesn't. Open source software is very different in terms of the affordances it provides, the kind of ideologies that sort of attend it, than what we're calling AI systems, which rely on huge amounts of compute to train. Well, that's certainly not open. An estimate, one training run of GPT-4 is $100 million. I don't know, this room could not pool $100 million to do that openly, right? So we're talking about a huge barrier to entry, and that these infrastructures for training it, these, AWS, the cloud compute systems, GPUs, are themselves pooled in the hands of a handful of companies, generally US and Chinese monopolies. So that's not open infrastructure. Okay, well then, you have data, and there are certainly data sets that are open. You can pull down Common Crawl, you can pull down the pile, and you can use those, but you can't use those before you put in a lot of labor-intensive work in terms of structuring, curating the data, making it ready to inform a model that will actually work in a way that would be profitable, marketable, and useful. So already, there's the open data, but it's a lot different than just sort of pulling down a software package and reusing it. And then there's a labor-intensive process of creating this AI that relies on thousands and thousands of often precarious and often invisibilized workers who have to instruct these systems as to what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. And you can look up stories on the company Sama in Kenya that was contracted by OpenAI to calibrate and train their GPT systems. And these workers have to be exposed to highly traumatic content because they are the human buffers to this inappropriate behavior. They have to see the content and then tell the system, this is what bad content looks like, this is what bad content looks like, this is what bad content looks like. People having breakdowns, people's relationships being torn apart, people with PTSD, because that kind of exposure is harmful to people's mental health and their relationships and communities. And that labor is not only not open, it's extremely expensive. It is, it's not open, and it is irreducible. You cannot launch a model that is trained on the gnarly detritus of the web without having people sort of tune it into a shape that will make it not offensive, not random, not reflecting that back out. And then there's deployment, right? And so yes, we can take one of these pre-trained models off the shelf. So once all of that is done, once the training and the calibration and this very expensive process is not very open, you can have the code of the trained model, the algorithm. You can pull that and you can fine tune it if you want to sort of calibrate for another use, or you can potentially deploy it. But this is not software, right? It's extremely expensive. So deploying these systems is also incredibly costly. We don't often have the numbers for this because the numbers for this exist between business-to-business contracts between the large tech companies and the people who say license their infrastructure or license their APIs. They're not made available in the public domain, which is also something we should question. But we do have one estimate, and this sounds right to me, having worked in the technical infrastructure group at Google for many years, that a training, 1 week of running ChatGPT, the Microsoft advertisement, costs as much as a training run for GPT-4. So we're looking, that's $100 million. So we're looking at incredibly high barriers to entry if you want to deploy AI at scale. So, I want to leave that there and sort of pass over to Udbhav to talk about, what does open source AI do that's kind of good within the very narrow frame that we can understand open source, right? Because it looks nothing like the software of the 90s, and it certainly does not level the playing field in any way or allow sort of innovation to flourish. It does provide some other affordances that, can be beneficial if we understand their limitations and their narrowness.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that 2 points. One, because we've been talking about open and open source, the definitions, I think, of open and open source, the way that they apply to the technologies we are talking about are very different, or at least the industry is attempting to make them very different to what they've traditionally meant. Until about 3 years ago, open source was what the Open Source Initiative said open source was, which is that it's a series of licenses which they read, and if your code is released under that license, it is an open source software or it is not an open source software. And I think that that's now gone from that, where of course the Mozilla public license exists, and it was a very interesting license in its time, because it was a license that specifically didn't mandate that you had to kind of also make the code that you used as a part of the license open source, which GPL licenses do, and that unlocked a lot of commercial and far more just profit driven innovation than other open source models. The difference between free and open source software was the kind of debate, and the Mozilla public license came out of that. Now in 2023 we have companies like Meta releasing models that say if you have more than 700 million users, you can't use it. If your market cap was above this much, you can't use it. If you have various criteria and caveats to their open source model releases that largely mean that we are releasing this because we want to gain from all of the benefits that arise from saying that we are doing something in the open, which is a model that I think that we've seen a lot in India with regard to how openness and just open has been used in so many contexts, but none of the actual benefits that accrue to the ecosystem in the limited frame that Meredith has already established. Where imagine a billionaire dies, you save them on a road crash, and he gives you $10 billion and say you're going to make the new AI system. You can do whatever you want, and you have this code. The odds are you can't do it because you simply just don't meet the criteria of that license, right? So they're definitely and this is something that I think we also really saw happen a little earlier when Google came out with things like TensorFlow, right? Which was the modeling library, where it was a very similar approach, but even though it was done in I think far more permissive licenses, the intention behind that was not really to make the world a better place. It was to create an ecosystem around those specific libraries that once you invest enough into, there is no other alternative in which you can actually carry out the functionalities that those libraries provide. And then that means that when you have say cloud compute and you can run TensorFlow really well on that, then that means that people suddenly start valuing your other offerings much more. So I think recognizing all of that points towards a lot of the problems that exist with just placing one's hope on open source, but I think the benefits still are quite tangible. Number one, the idea that you can actually see the code, I think is something that is very valuable in this space, even though it's not enough to say that this, just because you see the code it isn't biased, or just because you see the code it isn't discriminatory, but it sure is a hell lot better than reading a company's transparency report that they put out once in a year saying here are the 4 things we did for why it is biased or not biased. So the ability for why of what it may mean to be able to actually ask someone for a piece of information and independently verify whether it performs what you think it does is, I think, the underlying core benefit, and also enables others in the ecosystem to engage with the technology in a way that I think expands the paradigm that the companies would traditionally be comfortable with. Because the typical reason you'd expect Microsoft to say not release the source code of Windows like Linux exists is because people will tell you then, but why would anyone pay for a license? But I don't think that that's the actual answer. The actual answer is not just the fact that they won't be able to charge money, but also the fact that there are lots of other problems that exist with Windows as an operating system, from security to performance to compatibility, that would be naked and exposed to the world for the world to do whatever they want with. And if that logic makes sense for normal pieces of software, and that's why Signal is more secure than WhatsApp, because one is open source and the other is not. That same logic also applies to artificial intelligence systems, which is that just ignore what the code does, but as long as the code exists, is it better for people to be able to see it than not? And if it is, then I think governments need to start trying to account for some of that nuance as they're coming up with regulation.
Yeah, and this is literally, this last point is why it was so confusing when earlier this year, I think it was around February, a very prominent trade industry lobby group put out this letter addressed to the kind of European Commission and the European policy makers, which said the EU AI Act will harm open source innovation, and kind of making a loose argument for or making the argument for an open source AI exemption to the AI Act. And a lot of us said, well, aren't the particular requirements that they are resisting, those were requirements of documentation, reviewing for bias and discrimination, all of the things that you would assume a kind of open source company, in the sense that Udbhav just laid out, would be not just happy to comply with, but would comply with by default. And so that's when you get to what is the work that open source and its mythology and its halo is doing in the policy conversation. Yeah. And usually it's a deregulatory move, as we're seeing in the AI Act.
There's just one piece on the letter, and I think it's an important one. And if even if there's one takeaway on that piece for the audience, it's definitely the question of liability. Because how questions of liability work in open source software right now is your license says that they are not liable, literally. Which works in some countries, doesn't work in some countries. Maybe sometimes developers get sued. Most of the times they don't, which is why open source software realistically exists at the way in which it does, and that's why it can be used and remodified in the way that it does. And when it comes to AI technologies, because of how centralized their development really is, imagine you and I decide to take a copy of the Llama model and just maybe add 2 things to it that make it better for the Indian context, just hypothetically. Yeah. How does liability in that frame work under something like the AI Act is really a question that software or product liability regulation actually has not dealt with at all. And for some, and I was pretty surprised, both as a person who was working in this space for some time, but I haven't, it's not a problem unique to generative AI. It's actually a problem that exists for all pieces of software, but it's this conversation that has really precipitated that conversation to the point where there are people fretting about what will or will not happen. So in that entire letter, that I think that is the only legitimate question.
Yeah, that is a really good point. And also, as we found at that point, they were kind of arguing that the foundation model stage could potentially be exempt because there was no end use, and so there was no risk. And there's a kind of whole, a whole separate conversation to your point on where should the accountability lie, and the right answer should be throughout the chain, I think. Meredith, do you want to come in on that?
I mean, I could come in on, I think that is a really good point. And I think, I want to just point out one of the dynamics that is happening with this letter is that the ideology and halo of open source software that sort of sprang up in the 90s is being used in a way to sort of distract from the reality of what these AI systems are and who can deploy them. So, the desire that open source software be exempt from these checks is, sort of trading on a mythology that, well, we don't want to hamper the small innovators, we don't want to stymie innovation, we want 1,000 flowers of open source AI to bloom, and that is the way that AI will sort of move forward as a more democratic set of technologies. These same companies know that ultimately they're the ones who control the development environments, they're the ones that have the resources to create these systems. They might sort of give a little bit of access here and there to different research labs to develop a prototype, but ultimately these are technologies that depend on the type of centralization that these companies have. And so there's a sort of how do we get access to models that we won't be liable for by trading on a mythology of open source, when we know that ultimately whatever the model is called, we're going to be the ones who have the affordances to develop and benefit from them at least at production scale.
Okay, I could ask many more questions, but I think I'll open it up, and then if we have a lull in questions, then I have many, many more. Okay. Is someone actually...
Is someone going to moderate? Because I could...
You can just say you like that.
So I have both.
Thanks. So I have both a statement as well as a question. The statement relates to the example of COVID, and that's a good example of not needing AI to create accidentally create a bioweapon. So you don't really need AI to go down that route. In terms of the question, if all of these large language models and deployments, foundational models, are being deployed by big tech, the biases that would be in those models, how do you circumvent those biases?
I mean, there is no methodology to circumvent those biases, and the emergent properties of these systems mean it's very difficult to ensure, simply from looking at the technical documentation, code, and data, that a model isn't biased. There's a larger sort of picture answer to that is, these models are trained on web data, the detritus of our reality, right? They are always going to reflect the past and the present and project that into the future. There is no way to step behind a Cartesian window and suddenly create an objective model. These will reflect those biases, and that should instruct us that they may not be appropriate for certain uses, not propel us toward the impossible task of somehow scrubbing the data of our lives of the traces of our lives.
I have a philosophical question. The hope that we can reason our way through this challenge or regulate or legislate our way through this challenge rests on the assumption that we can develop the appropriate conceptual model. That we can develop the appropriate conceptual model, which is really trying to use the idea of a conceptual model against complexity. And the situation is incredibly complex because, the lines are blurred between the physical and the virtual, the local and the non-local, and so many other, the private and the public. So should we really be stepping back and use strategies of complexity and emergence? That particularly the fact that, for example, complex systems tend to develop attractors which do not make them totally deterministic, but prevent them from being completely random. So should we be using that as a framework to tackle this challenge?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that would necessarily solve the problems that you highlighted, because in the kind of systems that you describe, a world in which changing the way in which individuals either interact with them or individuals who create them, tweak them for the individuals who will ultimately utilize them, is a world in which, for the reasons of complexity that you laid out, which are the fact that there is no way in which we could truly separate public from private, local from non-local, or like other ways in which these systems end up in, like essentially being complicated enough that I think the ultimate word that Meredith used at the end was detritus. The fact that like these are not deliberate ideas of things that we have carefully placed in the world around us, and once they can be incorporated, it will be amazing. But it's literally consequence of how we go about living our lives will mean that no matter what you do with that system and how you change it, like the net outcome, I think, will still always be an imperfect one.
And I just want to add, yes, these systems and their emergent properties produce complexities that are beyond sort of probabilistic modeling, right? We can't say what this system will do in XYZ situation. But as a materialist, there are some things that are very simple, right? These run in data centers, run by large corporations. The data centers can be unplugged. They can be regulated. If we banned surveillance advertising today, we would see a lull in a lot of the AI development, right? There are levers that we have and material analyses we can take that actually help us break down the political economy of these actors and sort of see through a lot of the hype and I think the sort of trading on complexity that a lot of these companies do to be like, we can't predict it, that means it's magical, that means it's conscious, that means it's sort of out of our conceptual control. So I think if we look at the political economy and the sort of material affordances required to produce these systems, we have a much clearer picture on what levers we have and what we can do to shape them or prevent them from shaping us than if we look solely at the technical affordances and sort of take that as the core problematic.
I'm going to take the next question, and at the risk of sounding like a chorus, I would just add to that this is very similar to the argument around complexity and abstraction and actually philosophy that we're hearing in many of the same rooms I talked about, where the debate has become all about not just how complex these tools are, but how unknowable they are. And so I think the move there is to say this isn't about these systems, but it's about people deciding where they are used and whom they are used on. And I think that very much is not a very complex or abstract question. Is there some hands at the back?
There's a mic in the back as well.
Okay, so
All the way in the back of the wall. I've seen some hands for a second.
Yeah, all the way at the back, and then we can. Sorry, sorry, okay. Just because I feel like they keep raising their hands, can we start at the back and then move forward?
Hey, thank you. We spoke about like big tech versus small tech in this AI discourse. I think, Amba, you spoke one line about labor being missed in this entire conversation. And so far we have spent around 40 minutes talking about everything but labor.
No, I talked about labor, right? In the center.
Yeah, absolutely. I was reading your paper while I was going through the conversation. So can we more talk about the impact part that you just talked about? That these are abstract systems, but with very, very real impact into our current socio-economic conditions, not extended over the whole altruistic 100 years of time. What is it going to the labor market now that we should really, really design the systems around? Or whether they're policies or litigation, legal loopholes, whatever, right? That discourse is, and especially in the light of the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes, where they had a pretty major win. Why aren't we discussing that? I don't, as a person, I'm a techie, but I really don't care about what big tech versus small tech can do. We are all the same. If we can get bigger, the small tech will want to get bigger. Where is the labor conversation?
I guess this is a bit of a false binary, because I think the conversation about big tech versus small tech is actually a question about the concentration of power in the tech industry and what that concentration of power does when on the other side of the negotiating table you have labor unions or unorganized, unionized workers as well, right? So I don't know if there was more to that question. I think you already know about the labor landscape. I think one of the fault lines in the conversation about labor and AI is, on the one hand, this kind of deterministic rhetoric about how AI is going to replace human tasks and what tasks it's going to replace. And that can become deterministic and again be kind of criticism that's hype that's actually, hype in disguise. And I think the real conversation you want to be having there is in what ways are we kind of trying to devalue certain kinds of labor by pushing forward those narratives. And that's been happening a lot, especially I was listening to Brad Smith in the Senate saying, we're not actually that worried about labor because it'll only be those repetitive, minute, banal tasks that we think are going to be replaced, which kind of like showed his colors in terms of what is the kind of economic class that he and the company primarily represents. Do you want to add anything?
No, I've written and spoken about AI and labor a lot in the past, and I think ultimately it is the big tech analysis is critical, as Amba says, because we recognize big tech's business model, the cost of creating these systems, and thus the actors who will be able to afford to use them and their incentives. So we need to look at the incentives driving both the creation of AI, which is sort of social control and at different levels, and the incentives that will drive different actors to license that AI for use. This is not a tool for us. This is a tool that will be used on us. And I think the SAG and WGA strikes, they made big wins, but that is a line we have to hold and push forward. That is not sort of the final sort of determination. So this is, these are tools of labor degradation that will be used for surveillance and control of workers and will be used to justify further degrading working conditions by saying, you are no longer a skilled worker, you are a repetitive worker, you are no longer a, taxi driver, you are a gig driver. And we need to always look at these systems through that lens, but we can't understand why that is so true unless we look at the concentration of power in the tech sector and the way that will be sort of leveraged by other, powerful actors.
Yeah. So in all the discussions we had, I noticed a kind of a dichotomy that you always frame it in terms of open source versus closed source and all, but never centralized versus decentralized. Why there is a choice between having Delaware C Corp versus a CCP? Why can't we have a DAO, like a decentralized autonomous body, and where all the trust and safety parameter, where it can be deployed and cannot be deployed, can be controlled by a more democratic fashion? I don't see why shifting control from boardroom to Senate and Parliament will be any better. Or regulator for that matter. Why can't we have a truly decentralized? Why you always frame it as a open versus closed and industrial versus academic debate? It's a false dichotomy.
Sure. Would you like me to take that? Yeah. I don't think it's a false dichotomy, mostly because most people who I've spoken to about the models that you're talking about would argue that they are one or the other. Most of them claim that they are more open. And also I think that if there's one thing that we've realized is that there are definitely things that absolute direct 100% representative democracy is good for, and there are many things for which absolute direct 100% democracy is not good for, because another word for absolute direct 100% representative democracy is majoritarianism, because that means that as long as you have critical mass and consensus, whatever that critical mass of consensus people decide to do at a given point in time will happen. And that's exactly, to take the extension, is exactly how most of the things that human civilization should be deeply ashamed of in the past have occurred in practice. And if one agrees with that premise, which is that there is a role for specialization, that there is a role for people in society to perform certain activities in a certain way, and for law and regulation to exist because there are certain practices that should not be allowed, I think applied to the AI space, it raises some really interesting questions, right? The first is, are there certain kinds of technologies that should never be developed in the first place because they're too bad or harmful, and the consequence of society would be net negative? Even if they are developed, are there certain use cases to which those technologies should never be applied to because of the fact that if they are, the consequences will be too harsh? And finally, at what point will we realize, after we have failed the first question and the second question, that we have learned our lesson that technology should not be deployed in these use cases, and once we've learned that lesson, we will stop doing so? And I think that if you take that framing and decide to apply it to most of these conversations, we'll see that it completely skips the societal notion or idea of what impact technology can have on society, and presumes that it's the technocrats and the technologists who are developing these societies who either know the answers, or that somehow large-scale members of the public will understand how complicated these technologies really are, and therefore by consensus voting decide what should or should not happen. So yeah, those are just my thoughts.
Isn't that
but I think Meredith,
can we just move on?
Isn't that putting too much power into the hand of the person who decides what should be built?
I just don't think you're asking a technical question. I think you're asking a fundamental question about how we organize collectivity in our world.
Okay, on that note.
So my question, I'm actually a machine learning student, and it's a question a little more specific to AI now. So I feel the need that in this age, we're feeling the need for conducting a socio-technical evaluation by incorporating ideas of intersectional justice, equity, in critical theory in our policies. So my question is, what role can we play in the discourse? How do we become, part of it? I mean, for example, how do you be part of projects or something that your organization works on? And like something like working towards, clear and concrete benchmarks for the harmful impact of such, technologies. And, I think I'm done.
Thank you.
That was a really good question. Thank you. And I think on the question of what we are doing as an organization, let's talk after this, and I can share more with you. I think is it a healthy trend that we're moving away from solely technical evaluation and an understanding that these systems are embedded in society, and therefore need to be evaluated as part of their social systems? 100% it's a good idea. I would just kind of summarize a much longer conversation to say that the concern, however, is that what is happening, as happens with any evaluation or benchmark, is that space for evaluation is also getting captured, and so are those benchmarks, in a way where it's like, okay, we have developed a socio-technical evaluation standard checklist for AI systems. Once you meet these 10 benchmarks, you are all clear, 100% bias-free, as one example. And so what we would say there is that we need to be really worried about the kind of certification checkbox regime of any standards, including quote-unquote socio-technical standards, especially because I think making claims that systems are bias-free based on a kind of ex-ante evaluation rather than kind of understanding not just their effects in the wild, but who is using them, who is subject to them. I think these are ongoing political evaluations and not just technical or socio-technical ones, which I know is a lot of word soup, but just to say that I think we should be worried about a kind of audit regime now developing on the back of this kind of new evaluation imagination. Did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a contest of power, not a contest of ideas. And so we need to be very careful about how our ideas will be captured by those who have power and turned into, as Amba said, a checkbox regime, and not something that actually embodies the spirit of ensuring that these systems are safe for the people who are most at risk.
There's a question in the back.
This is taking off from what Udbhav had mentioned about not having certain kind of technologies developed at all. The interesting parallel that we have is with the nuclear disarmament, where that kind of trying to do a ban hasn't been particularly successful. And there is also a parallel now with the number of nations looking to envelop AI within a discourse of a strategic imperative. When it is becoming a strategic imperative, how realistic is that kind of a goal of ban, particularly when we saw in nuclear disarmament, we've not been able to achieve that. In fact, it is now concentrated with about 6 or 7 players who were able to do tests, and others who are not able to survive.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. No, I mean, I think that the difference there is rather than, I think it's the comparison that's I'd like to push back upon, because the idea of what the kind of technologies that we're talking about should not be, this could be kryptonite or this could be Superman, so do we deserve our heroes kind of positioning, which is how nuclear weapons are looked at in international discourse, right? Deterrence, we have this, you can't touch us, because we have this, you'll never be able to invade us. It's much more on is the price that we pay as a society to develop them a price that is worth paying or not in the first place is a much more, I think, like rational question to ask. So for example, if you were to take like, and you can do this in different lenses, but just like the labor lens and everything that like Meredith spoke about labor, like history is full of practices that were very great, very profitable and brought untold riches to countries that we decided as a collective of nations are so bad that we should not do them. Maybe one of them can be like this idea of what a minimum wage for someone who works in some of these models should look like. Maybe it would be that we should not train models to be able to tell people from a certain skin color from another skin color, because whatever happens if those technologies are developed, it is not going to be a net good for the world, no matter how accurately we come up with them, right? So rather than trying to view Gen AI as one monolith construct of whether it should exist or not, I think it's much more about what subcomponents of it are, which of those subcomponents are net banal, so it's fine, or are useful maybe even, but what subcomponents of it should never be created, which is also not just a Gen AI question, it's like a technology question. And finally, there's also like the price that, the process that we have to pay in order to create them in the first place, and whether that process is something that requires interrogation in society or not, right? Like, so for example, like certain kinds of mining don't happen in Europe because of like just mining laws existing in the last 20 years that say you can't send human beings into areas like that. If a machine goes, it's okay. If it doesn't go, it's not. People would tell you here that, yeah, that's India's competitive advantage, the fact that we can send human beings to do those things, and that's why we mine these minerals for cheaper. But then we should ask ourselves, like, what do we want to be? Do we want to be people who send our people to do that, or are we okay not having that economic advantage because we value certain things more than, like economic influence?
Everything he said, I was just going to comment because you asked the question of how difficult or easy will it be to ban or restrict. I am not getting tired of repeating this story because I think it really is so egregious. But the recent, White House commitments on frontier AI models, one of the kind of, if you kind of read the fine print and they've sort of made all of these commitments about transparency and accountability and security and resilience that apply to so-called frontier models. But the way in which frontier models has been defined is anything that is, in quotes, more powerful than the current industry frontier. Obviously, there's no definition of what more powerful will mean. So what that means is that we're all having this debate about, like, is it good? Is self-regulation good? But the real conversation to be had is that these companies are specifically exempting everything that is currently on the market. They're like, what's out of the bag is out of the bag. Now let's talk about bioweapons and the things that we don't know exist yet. So it's a really particular move, I think, to foreclose the conversation about the appropriateness or otherwise of what's on the market today, which is a whole move.
Yeah. So my question is probably not very technical, but it's with respect to regulations. So, in the past decade, we've seen how different governments across the world, have laid down regulations for data fiduciaries, data processors, and, social media platforms, and aggregators, and different big tech and small tech companies. So the thing that I wanted to ask was, most of these regulations, lay down compliance mechanisms for the big tech. Startups and MSMEs are generally given some kind of a exemption or some kind of a leeway. So in the AI atmosphere, AI ecosystem, do you see that as a threat, or do you think that they should be given that kind of exemption? What is your say?
On whether they should be given an exemption, I mean, I think that there's a very similar conversation to what we were saying about open source, right? Like, I think the question should be, I also think there's this trope with the small business exemption point that, like, regulation is necessarily burden. And I think there are, like, that trope is itself damaging, and it, for example, with the GDPR, this was a major thing, right? That, like, what is its impact? It's only entrenching big tech. I think there's a conversation to be had, as it was had in data protection, about proportionality and requirements. But I think particularly when we're talking about large language models or generative AI models, and we're talking about what essentially is a game of scale, I think it would be hard pressed to argue that just because, for example, you're an open source or you're like a smaller company in some dimension, that you should somehow be exempt from particularly the kind of accountability, the kind of baseline accountability that some of these laws are considering, which would just be data and design, kind of data and algorithmic design governance questions, or just reflexivity with kind of what data is being used, bias scrutiny and that kind of thing. but I don't know if you have more thoughts.
Yeah, I think that like there are also two kinds of burdens. I think that everything that you posed in that question applies to some parts of like pure compliance burdens, things that you would need to hire 20 people to do, and therefore maybe things that if you're a company of 3 people, you'll have to kind of think about. But I think the reality is that if you're doing things that would require 20 people to do compliance, you should probably hire those 20 people to do compliance before you start doing your thing. And that's because in most laws and regulations, the way that they're anyway structured to ensure that there is kind of like a reasonable base minimum standard, and then after that there are, if you'd say dealing with sensitive data or deploying in use cases that are extra sensitive, that you have to start doing more of those things. And I don't think your size should necessarily matter if you're operating in those extra sensitive or important use cases, because the consequences of failure there can be drastic, where saying that sorry I was small is not an excuse to, if like say patients die because you didn't take like medical data seriously enough, or like something went wrong when you were processing them in a particular way.
Just to sort of add on to this, and this actually gets back to the nuclear point as well, and in some way, I think we need to be clear that like the startup ecosystem and the small tech ecosystem doesn't exist now in the same way it existed in the 2000s. Right? Like most AI startups that I'm aware of when I talk to people are actually just licensing an API from Google Cloud or AWS or Azure, repackaging it for their use, right? If they're taking a pre-trained model that they didn't train because it's incredibly expensive, as we already reviewed, and tuning it, they're still deploying that on AWS or Azure or Google Cloud or maybe some others, right? So they're actually like, startups are like barnacles on the hull of big tech. There isn't just an independent startup ecosystem that we need to protect. These things are freighted with big tech and actually rely on their infrastructures both to train these models and create them, because there are very few actors that, no actor has their own, they'll be licensing some of this compute somehow from one of these actors if they are sort of training their own. And also for deployment. No one runs their own servers. So this gets back to the sort of like, how do we let the cat out of the bag? Like the cats aren't actually out of the bag. There are a couple of bags, right? And these are called big tech companies. And if AWS and Google Cloud and Azure and Tencent tomorrow said like, none of this shit can run on our servers, we would have, walked back generative AI significantly. It would not be existing because no one can deploy at scale tech without access to those servers. So we do have significant choke points that I believe the narrative of sort of proliferation that then is sort of hitched on to a metaphorical terms from the nuclear debate is actually doing disservice to.
So in the context of like say the hard problem of consciousness, it's becoming very relevant to AI as well. Like people like Kastrup and Chalmers are discussing this. So if we don't quite understand what conscious means, because there are a lot of philosophical definitions where consciousness itself is just a property that can arise out of conditions that is well substantiated in some philosophy. So we don't just understand what conscious is. There's no reason to label anything as good or evil. Both of them are relative in that sense, because most of the world is working on the premise that reality is ontologically complete. But there is, which means there since decades that reality itself is incomplete. So if AI or aliens, it's just hypothetical, but it's discussion going on. If reality itself is incomplete, we are actually obstructing this this perfection, to achieve this perfection in the form of AI and aliens coming. They may be in the future, in the sense that it might be disaster in the near future, but in the long run, it might be actually helpful for humanity that the external emergence is actually helpful to humans in that sense. Because everyone works that we are already complete, we derive a model from one single.
Is there a question? What's the question?
Yeah. So the AI, I'm saying the paradigm should shift, that AI should consider that reality is not actually ontologically complete. So that will give a different set of moral values and say the harshness will differ, because we are already doing animal cloning.
I think it's interesting as a story to consider, but I didn't hear a question in there.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Good evening. What is the AI effect in terms of macroeconomic level in future? in 5 year, 10 year, 15 years down the line?
Well, we're hitting the point where climate chaos is becoming a reality, and of course, past data makes it hard to, when we hit a sort of inflection point on a log scale, it makes it very difficult to predict the future based on past data. So I think, also as a materialist, I don't think the future is an invitation, it's not a promise. And so I think I don't know what the macroeconomic factors are, because will there be enough energy in 30 years, on our planet to run these massive data centers? I don't know what the future holds, because I don't know what, agricultural patterns how they will change as sort of climate becomes more hostile and weather becomes more erratic. So I think we need to recognize that the future is not going to look a lot like the past that we're familiar with, and be very humble in our predictions, while we also take up the mantle of, being determined to fight for a future we can live in.
Can we take, maybe for the last few questions, can we just take them together, and we'll probably do this is the last closing round, right? We have 10 minutes. Okay, so maybe we'll do 2 sets, but let's take this. Yeah, 2 or 3.
So my question leads on from your answer. My question is, what is the current accountability framework for sustainability and carbon footprint on these artificial intelligence infrastructure? One from the corporate angle, and also from the various governments supporting AI infrastructure. So both public and private infrastructure. Love to hear your points of view on that.
Great. So we'll save that, and then.
So mine is a bit more related to the literature. What do you think about the claim that AI as an architecture, as a technology, has stagnated? For instance, the idea would be something like, since 2017, no theoretical advancement has been made on the transformer model. For instance, even GPT-4, there are rumors that there is 8 GPT-3 models which are trained for specific tasks and then put on the system. And we can't know that, right? Because it's closed source. We don't know what the source code looks like. What do you think about that claim? The claim that AI architectures, mathematically, theoretically, are stagnated, and we need something to get us out of this rut that we're in.
I think, are you asking about whether we think that there's a stagnation in the field? Yeah, so I can't I won't answer that in terms of math innovation, but I might redirect your question to say, I think what we are talking about a lot today, we've chatted about some of this today, is that it seems that the kind of competitive advantage between the companies that exist today is going to be on the basis of data and compute. So we don't know what GPT-4 trained its model on, but we have heard that it could potentially have been proprietary data, and I think going forward, we're hearing, again, there was rumors that were then shot down that maybe Bard was trained on Gmail data. Whether or not that's true today, I think it is without question the fact that, and Meredith said this before, right? There is no AI, AI is sort of going to be trained on the fire hose of data that is being generated by commercial surveillance today. And so I think the innovation, if any, might be on what proprietary data sets these companies can get their hands on in addition to what is generally available. And I think similarly in compute, we're going to see another kind of innovation, which is vertical integration throughout the stack. So whether that's cloud providers going up and down the stack, both to chip hardware as well as to the model layer, becoming model aggregators. I'm more interested and also more worried about that kind of sphere of innovation and what it will do to, again, the prospect of more open innovation, or in the way, I guess, you meant it.
I'll tag onto that, and then we can answer the sustainability question. I think, throughout, since 2012, when AI became kind of the first hype wave in our current hype era, that was with the AlexNet paper, the technologies of AI are not the variable. The innovations in the architecture of AI are not the competitive advantage. The advantage is how much data do you have and how much compute you have. Convolutional neural nets are from 1989. The reason we didn't hear about them until 2012 is because we didn't have a consolidated surveillance industry that had both the compute and the data. And so I don't think, I think we can actually trace transformers pretty clearly back to that genealogy. There have been a couple of adjustments, but I think these companies make a huge amount of hay about these sort of, technical innovations, when in fact that's, what we're talking about is a race to brute force scale. And then I don't, on the sustainability one, I don't, this is not an area I'm as familiar with, but, we looked at, there was a report that Microsoft water consumption, which is required to cool their massive data centers, went up a significant amount because of their sort of offering, GPT, the ChatGPT. So, the offering of these tools and the computational intensity of, required to run them at production or to train them is certainly having serious ecological consequences. And we're seeing nothing but sort of word games and symbols as a sort of, ecological accountability and sustainability plan. And by that I mean sort of, carbon offsets and these sort of, like economic mind games that don't actually address the fact that these data centers are moving into people's towns, they're moving into people's communities, they are siphoning off the water, they're making side deals with in the US kind of corrupt city councils that are actually sort of threatening people's ability to live, and we should expect this to become kind of almost a ratchet that is turning to a point where you begin to see conflicts around this. There's towns in the United States that are now trying to organize and reject these data centers. So we are, AI is ecologically devastating because of the energy and water use it requires, and it's certainly not going to be sustainable to sort of run this kind of like gimmicky WhatsApp AI features everywhere type of world into the future. But what will be done about that, I don't know what has been done about climate. It's a pretty grim picture when we look at it. So I don't know.
Yeah, okay. We have 8 billion people and 2 billion smartphones, and that's only growing.
Yeah. And that's and the fact that we don't have a better answer is very frightening and says maybe the people who are in control should not be in control.
And just one, I guess, additional point to add to what Mayor said is just so industrial policy is another meme in the AI space right now. So a lot of governments are kind of scrambling to say, this is our vision for how we will be relevant in the AI future. And there's been some really interesting, again, counter-critical thinking, which is saying based on its climate impact and its kind of what Meredith mentioned, so both water, but also kind of toxic waste generation at every layer. Is kind of deindustrialization, de-escalation, I'm missing the word right now, but a kind of wind down as an industrial strategy that might apply to AI at some point. It might be the most sane way ahead based on in its environmental footprint alone.
One question here and then one more in the front.
Thanks. Could you speak to the role of nation states that are not the US or China? Do they have any sort of agency in terms of regulation, or are they just onlookers?
One more in the front. This conversation makes me feel guilty for using all the artificial intelligence tools in my work. I hadn't been aware of the grim realities of artificial intelligence like most of the tech folks here have been. And it saddens me every time I pass through a college conversation or back in my office, I see everybody using artificial intelligence tools just to get ahead. How have you been able to, as individuals who use technology, been able to navigate around artificial intelligence? Quick background, my team and I have tried to switch from Google to DuckDuckGo. It hasn't worked. We've tried to go from Chrome to Mozilla, but then Chrome is just... and the same can be said for WhatsApp and Signal. Not offending any of you, but then just saying my reality. How do you individually navigate and what apps and softwares do you use?
By desperately installing Firefox in every person I meet's phone, But no, I mean, I think it's a really good question. And the modality...
Every time people laugh,
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's something that you'd be surprised by the kind of rooms I've been told that. But anyway, no, I think that on the deeper point, at least I think it's a deeply personal answer. So maybe different folks would have different things. I know that what I try to do, and it's definitely something I think we try doing at Mozilla as well, is that there's always a trade-off, I think, between efficiency, performance, and or especially when it's being used for work and all of the other values that people subscribe to. it can be applied to other places. Like, do you take a plane to go or do you take a train to go, if both are equally possible to go? And then you kind of decide, like, I have to be there, I don't have to be there. If I have to be there for this, then it's okay. Maybe it's the only way I can go. And in some way, I think that applies to technology too. Like, I, as an individual, for example, deleted my Facebook account like well before Cambridge Analytica because I was worried about it. But that was also because I work in this space and I'd heard of some of those practices from before I did. So it's not a kind of testament on how much, it's so dependent on how much you know, how comfortable you are with it, that it ends up being personal. And when I moved countries like I did, I actually had to create a fake one because I wanted like furniture for cheap, and they just sold it only on those Facebook groups, you know. So like, which is why I think the reality is much more complicated, but I don't think that should necessarily take away from the broader political critique of whether what is happening is okay or not and what needs to change.
I'll add on to Udbhav's answer, and then maybe Amba, you can answer the nation states question. I'm constantly reminded of the fact that I only learned, a few years ago that it was actually the fossil fuel lobby that created the concept of your personal sort of carbon footprint. And this was a way of individualizing a structural problem. So I suddenly had to be concerned about my own behavior as if somehow I was, affecting the full carbon footprint. When you look at, what are the industries that actually are producing carbon, it's not like Meredith's little choices, although those add up. It is something much bigger and more structural that will require something like organizing or, resistance to oppose. So I think, the same thing around technology, right? I run WhatsApp because there are people who are not on Signal, who I, am not going to lobby to be on Signal because I love them and I don't want to be annoying, and I contact them on WhatsApp because communication is about connecting with the people I love and need to talk to. It's not about like ideological purity. And I think we need to recognize that these companies have become core infrastructure threaded through our economies and institutions. We don't get to live in a world unless we're some kind of monk in the woods without availing of ourselves of these infrastructures. And that means that we should hold them to much higher standards. We should not believe for a second this sort of narrative of individual choice. Now, almost everyone I know is on Signal because I did labor organizing at Google. And I mean, I've been a privacy person for a long time, but there is a moment when you're actually facing a very powerful adversary where your stomach drops and you know how precious privacy is. You know that like, if they had had access to our messages at the beginning of organizing, there would not have been a movement that was able to do anything because we all would have been fired because they would have figured out a pretext and they would have done it, right? So there are moments when we are all compelled to sort of adopt different practices or to make sacrifices, and those, we're in a world where I believe for a lot of people those moments are coming, faster and quicker. But ultimately, I think what we need to do is actually sort of, everything is organizing when it comes down to it. We need to push for the structural changes and not internalize a sense of personal responsibility that can actually be detrimental to a vision for broader change that would kind of address some of these core issues.
I feel like that was a nicer note to end on, and now I have to go into wonky land again. To the question on is it only US and China, my first reaction, I don't remember who was asking this question. Yeah, I guess my first reaction is that the European regulators would be really disappointed that that's how you framed it, because they've spent the last 5-ish years now developing the EU's AI Act, and they're actually, the word has it, they're actually also, the European regulators and lawmakers are actually quite disappointed in this blank slate rhetoric that's developed in the last 6 months or year around AI, because they've actually been developing AI regulation for a while. But I think your question was more sort of like, who can actually like play the regulation game? And I think there the answer is there's a question of who can do it, and I would argue like other countries can and have and should, but and I think there'd be some nuance there on enforceability and whose governments and are tech companies most worried about, and who are they going to come to the table for, and that'll depend on the market and how valuable it is. But keeping that aside, I think I just want to redirect to say something that is very I'm seeing it very acutely in the US context, which is there's something about the AI policy landscape. One way to put it is corporate capture, and of course there's a lot of lobbying money that is completely that is flowing through DC as it always has. But more importantly, what we're seeing in this moment is this sheen and like shininess of AI as a new toy also has its own kind of, I don't know whether to call it an emotional appeal or what appeal it has, but it is the shiny new toy, and all of the kind of lawmakers want to be seen as promoting it and not regulating it. So I would imagine that appeal, the appeal of having these fancy tech executives that are at the cutting edge of innovation and maybe even sentience, if you believe them, will be sitting in your room and talking to you about the future. I wouldn't discount how powerful that's been in actually chilling innovation. We've seen Senator Chuck Schumer, who's majority leader, for example, who's supposed to be at the helm of governance, convene a series of experts on how to regulate AI. And I would say 85% of that room was just tech CEOs and tech executives. So I would say that there's just and on China, I think that's a more complicated question, because there's actually a lot of so-called generative AI regulation that is already floating around, but B, as with any kind of Chinese regulatory conversation, I think what filters through to Western media and how to understand it is more complex. But I guess I would say that it's just like, in general, globally, we're at a moment when I would say that corporate capture is very, very real, and so it's more a question of which government will actually take that step forward and take a kind of strong regulatory stance against the current. So yeah, trade agreements. I won't get that wonky right now. Sure.
Yeah, we are out of time, and one of the things BIC prides itself in is not just starting on time, but also ending on time. The panelists will be around for a little longer, but thank you, Amba, Udbhav, and Meredith, for an absolutely fascinating and mostly scary conversation. Thank you.